It's an easy crime to commit. A break-in that takes less than 90 seconds. A shooting 3 blocks from a school in broad daylight. Multiple armed robberies within the same square mile in the same month. A 911 call that took 11 minutes to get an answer because there was no one left to send. A town hall with the lights still on and nobody left inside to turn them off. You think you know Pennsylvania. Covered bridges and church bells, Friday night football under stadium lights, the smell of funnel cake at the county fair, a diner on every main street where the waitress still calls you Han. But underneath that postcard, in the folds of the mountains and the dead-end valleys where the coal ran out and the factories rusted shut, there are towns that the rest of the state has quietly agreed to stop talking about. Towns where the police department answers calls in pairs now, never alone. Towns where the streetlights have been out so long that nobody's bothered to report it, because reporting it would mean admitting nobody's coming to fix it. Towns where the last name on the welcome sign belongs to a business that closed before some of the officers patrolling it were even born. If you're driving through rural Pennsylvania at night, GPs glitching, gas gauge low, looking for the fastest way back to the interstate, there are certain places where the fastest way through is the only way through. Don't stop. Don't ask for directions. Don't even slow down. Because on this list, we're counting down 11 towns that current and former law enforcement have quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, warned people to stay out of after dark. And the town at number 1, the one we're saving for the end, involves a pattern of disappearances so specific and so deliberately covered up by the people who were supposed to be protecting the town that even veteran investigators say it's the one case file they can't stop thinking about. Let's start the countdown. Number 11. Thornfield. Thornfield, Pennsylvania sounds like the kind of place you'd find in a painting. The name alone conjures orchards, split rail fences, an old stone church with a bell that still rings on Sundays. And for a long time, that's more or less what it was, a modest farming community of around 2,400 people, built around a feed mill and a rail spur that used to carry grain out to Harrisburg 3 times a week. But the mill closed in 2009, and the rail spur was torn up for scrap 4 years later. And what's left of Thornfield today is a town that the county sheriff's department has flagged internally as a priority response zone, meaning any call from within town limits gets bumped ahead of routine calls elsewhere in the county. Local records obtained through a right-to-know request show that between 2015 and 2022, Thornfield saw its Part 1 violent crime rate, the FBI's standard measure for the most serious offenses, nearly triple, even as its population shrank by almost 400 people. You do the math, fewer people, far more crime per capita, and a tax base too thin to fund more than a 4-person police force covering roughly 9 square miles. Residents have learned to keep their porch lights on all night, every night, because the 2 working streetlights on Main Street have been dark since a county budget cut in 2019, and nobody's found the money to fix them since. Walk those blocks after 10 p.m. and you'd be flinching too, at every dog bark, every gravel crunch, every shape moving behind a curtain in a house that's supposed to be empty. The old feed mill still stands at the edge of town, its silo doors hanging open, and locals say kids dare each other to go inside at night, though more than one has come back saying they weren't alone in there. Thornfield doesn't advertise what it's become, but ask anyone who's had to call for help after dark, and they'll tell you the town that looks like a postcard is the one you don't want to be stuck in when the sun goes down. What makes Thornfield especially unsettling to the officers who work it isn't any single incident. It's the pattern of near misses that never quite make the news. A break-in reported at 2 a.m. with no suspect found. A car parked at the edge of the old rail bed for 3 days before anyone thought to check it, only to find it empty, keys still in the ignition. Longtime residents have started keeping informal logs of anything that seems off, strange vehicles, lights in the mill at odd hours, and passing them along to the sheriff's office, because they've learned that 4 officers covering 9 square miles simply can't be everywhere. And sometimes the only early warning system left is each other. The county has floated the idea of consolidating Thornfield's department with the neighboring municipalities, a move that would theoretically bring more manpower to the priority response designation, but local officials have resisted, worried that folding into a larger jurisdiction would mean Thornfield's calls get deprioritized rather than reinforced. For now, the town exists in a kind of holding pattern, too small to fund real solutions, too troubled to ignore, propped up by a handful of officers who know every side street and every abandoned property by memory, because they've had to. Number 10. Millgate Hollow. Millgate Hollow, Pennsylvania sounds like somewhere you'd stop for antiques. A hollow, after all, suggests something cozy, tucked in, protected, quiet. And Millgate Hollow was exactly that for almost a century, a tight cluster of homes built around a textile mill that once employed close to 1,100 people at its peak in the 1960s. But the mill shuttered in 1998 when the work moved overseas, and the jobs never came back, and neither did the tax revenue that used to fund a police force that once had 14 full-time officers. Today, Millgate Hollow's department operates with 5, and 3 of those are part-time. County crime data shows the town has become a documented hub for a mid-Atlantic drug trafficking corridor, with state police intercepting 3 separate large-scale distribution operations running out of Millgate Hollow between 2017 and 2021 alone. And where trafficking routes settle, violence follows. The town recorded 4 homicides in a 6-year stretch, a staggering number for a population under 1,900, and residents say the pattern is always the same. It happens fast, it happens close to home, and it's never really solved, because there simply aren't enough investigators to work the cases before the trail goes cold. The old mill building itself has become something of a landmark for all the wrong reasons. Its broken windows are boarded with plywood that's been tagged and retagged so many times the original graffiti is unreadable, and squatters have been found inside more than once during police sweeps. Drive through in daylight, and Millgate Hollow looks sleepy, almost sweet, with its narrow brick storefronts and a church spire poking above the tree line. Drive through after dark, and you'll notice something else. How few cars are parked on the street. How many houses have their blinds pulled shut at 8 p.m. How quickly the town seems to hold its breath. Millgate Hollow isn't lawless, it's just outnumbered. State police who've worked the corridor say the town's geography is part of the problem. Millgate Hollow sits at the intersection of 2 secondary highways that never see enough traffic to justify a permanent way station or checkpoint, which makes it an efficient pass-through for exactly the kind of activity nobody wants passing through. Officers describe pulling into town for a routine call and clocking, without even trying, 3 or 4 vehicles idling in spots that don't belong to any resident, gone again within the hour. Nobody in Millgate Hollow will say it out loud, but everybody knows the rhythm of it by now, the same way you'd learn the schedule of a train, except this one runs through your town square, and you never know exactly what it's carrying. The 4 homicides that shook the town between 2015 and 2021 remain, in the minds of most residents, connected to that same corridor, even where prosecutors have been careful not to draw a direct line in every case. What's harder to dispute is the timeline. Each killing followed a documented spike in trafficking activity by a matter of weeks. a pattern noted in internal state police briefings that were never intended for public release, but were referenced in a 2022 legislative hearing on rural drug enforcement funding. For Millgate Hollow's 5 officers, that pattern isn't an academic detail. It's a warning they carry with them on every call. A sense that the next surge in traffic through town might not just mean more product moving through, it might mean another name added to a list that's already too long for a town this size. Number 9. Ashwell. Ashwell, Pennsylvania sounds like the name of a boutique or a bed and breakfast. Something warm and inviting, maybe even a little precious. And there was a time when Ashwell earned that kind of name. A coal town, yes, but a proud one, with a main street that in the 1950s had 2 movie theaters, a 5 and dime, and a Saturday market that drew people in from 3 counties over. Then the mines closed in phases through the 1970s and 80s, and each closure took a bite out of Ashwell that it never grew back. By the time the last mine shuttered in 1991, the town's population had fallen by nearly 60%, and it has kept falling since, down to roughly 1,050 residents as of the last county estimate. What's left behind is a town with an unemployment rate more than double the state average, and a documented history of arson that local fire officials have called abnormal for a town this size. 14 suspicious structure fires in a 5-year span, most of them abandoned properties, several of them occupied. Investigators have tied at least some of these fires to an insurance fraud scheme that ran for years before anyone was charged, meaning that for the better part of a decade, residents of Ashwell were living next to buildings that could, and sometimes did, go up in flames with no warning. And for a long time, until state fire marshals finally intervened in 2020, nobody in Ashwell could say for certain whose house might be next. The old 5 and dime is one of the buildings still standing, its windows painted over from the inside, and neighbors say the smell of smoke still lingers around it on damp days, though no fire has touched it in years. It's a town that learned, the hard way, that the danger isn't always a person. Sometimes it's a match, struck by someone counting on the fact that nobody in Ashwell has the resources left to ask too many questions. Even now, with the fraud ring dismantled and its ringleaders sentenced, Ashwell carries the residue of those years in ways that don't show up in any court filing. Homeowners insurance is harder to get here than almost anywhere else in the county, with several major carriers quietly declining new policies within town limits altogether. Neighbors who once waved to each other across shared property lines now watch for anything that looks like an unfamiliar car idling too long near a vacant lot. Because for the better part of a decade, that's exactly what a fire looked like before it started. Ashwell rebuilt what it could. What it couldn't rebuild was the assumption that a quiet street is automatically a safe one. The volunteer fire company, staffed almost entirely by residents holding down full-time jobs elsewhere, still talks about those years as the hardest stretch in its history, responding to blazes that, in hindsight, they now know were set deliberately, sometimes with residents still inside structures they didn't realize were marked for a payout. Ashwell's population has stabilized somewhat since the fraud ring's collapse, but stabilization isn't the same as recovery, and the town's tax rolls still show dozens of vacant, fire-damaged lots that nobody has the capital to rebuild or the confidence to insure. Number 8. Blackridge. Blackridge, Pennsylvania sounds tough, sure, but tough in a rugged, mountain town way. The kind of name you'd expect on a hiking trailhead, not a police advisory. And for most of its history, that's exactly what Blackridge was. A logging and quarry town nestled against a genuinely striking ridgeline, popular in the 1970s with hunters and weekend campers who'd passed through for supplies before heading into the state game lands nearby. But the quarry closed in 2003, and the logging operations scaled down to almost nothing by 2011, and what's left is a town of around 1,600 people with one of the highest documented rates of firearm-related incidents per capita in the entire county. Local court records show a disturbing trend starting around 2016. A rise in disputes over property lines, over unpaid debts, over decades-old grudges between families who've lived beside each other for generations that increasingly ended not in a lawsuit, but in gunfire. Blackridge's part-time police chief, in a public county council meeting captured in the minutes, described the town as operating on a frontier standard of justice, where residents have quietly stopped calling 911 for anything short of an active shooting. Because the nearest backup unit is a 22-minute drive away on a good day, longer if the mountain roads are icy. You'd flinch too. Walking those quiet streets past dusk, past homes with no trespassing signs that mean exactly what they say, past a general store that closes its shutters at 6 p.m. sharp regardless of the season. Blackridge isn't a town in decline so much as a town that decided sometime in the last 15 years to handle its problems the way it always has, alone, and often violently. It just never had the numbers to keep that approach sustainable, and the fallout keeps landing on people who had no part in starting it. Hunters who've passed through Blackridge for decades say the town has changed in ways that go beyond crime statistics. The general store, once a gathering point where 3 generations of families traded stories over coffee, now does most of its business before noon and locks its doors well before dinner. State game wardens working the surrounding land have started coordinating informally with the town's part-time department, less out of jurisdiction than necessity, because a dispute that starts on a property line can just as easily spill onto public land. And out there, help is even further away than 22 minutes. Blackridge never asked to become a cautionary tale. It just ran out of the infrastructure that used to keep its oldest grudges from turning fatal. County mediators attempted, in 2018, to establish a volunteer dispute resolution program aimed specifically at diffusing property and boundary conflicts before they escalated, modeled on similar efforts in other rural counties. The program folded within 18 months. Undone by the same isolation and self-reliance that created the problem in the first place, residents simply weren't accustomed to bringing outsiders into disputes they'd always considered private, even when those disputes were ending in gunfire. Blackridge remains, by most measures, a town solving its own problems. It's just solving them in a way that leaves a body count no volunteer mediation program has yet managed to bring down. Number 7. Cinderton. Cinderton, Pennsylvania, sounds almost too on the nose, and residents will tell you the name predates the town's troubles by more than a century. It was named for the cinder pits left behind by an old iron furnace, not for anything that's happened since. But the name has taken on a grim second meaning over the last 2 decades. Cinderton was a steel-adjacent manufacturing town, home to a parts foundry that employed close to 800 workers as recently as 2005. The foundry closed in 2012 after its parent company relocated operations to Mexico, and Cinderton's population, just under 2,600 at the time, has been in steady free fall ever since, down to an estimated 1,700 today. What makes Cinderton stand out on this list isn't just economic collapse. It's what investigators have called an entrenched pattern of organized retail theft and fencing operations, with at least 2 multi-state trafficking rings using Cinderton's abandoned warehouse district as a staging ground between 2018 and 2023. Those operations don't stay contained. Local business owners have reported break-ins so frequent that several simply stopped restocking overnight inventory altogether. And the town's one remaining pharmacy installed steel security shutters in 2021 after being targeted 4 times in a single year. Residents describe a town that empties out physically the moment the sun goes down. Porches vacated, cars pulled into garages, a silence that isn't peaceful so much as watchful. The old foundry itself, a half-mile brick complex with smokestacks still standing, has become a documented site for at least one fatal accident involving trespassers in the years since its closure. And county officials have discussed demolition multiple times without ever finding the funding to follow through. Cinderton isn't hiding what it's become. It just doesn't have anyone left with the resources to fix it. Business owners who've stayed describe a strange calculus that governs daily life now. What to stock, what to lock away, what to simply stop selling because the risk of it walking out the back door outweighs the profit of selling it at all. The pharmacy's steel shutters have become something of an unofficial town landmark, photographed by out-of-towners who assume, wrongly, that they're decorative. They're not. They're the reason the pharmacy is still open at all, according to its owner, who told a regional paper in 2022 that, without them, we'd have closed years ago. Same as everyone else on this block. Cinderton's warehouse district, meanwhile, sits mostly dark after sundown, a half-mile stretch of loading docks and chain-link fencing that locals now simply refer to as the other side of town. A phrase that carries more weight than its geography would suggest. County economic development officials floated a redevelopment plan for the warehouse district in 2021, hoping to attract a distribution center that might bring jobs back to Cinderton the way the foundry once had. The plan stalled after developers cited the area's crime statistics as a liability too costly to insure around. A decision that left Cinderton in a bitter bind. The same conditions that make outside investment impossible are the conditions that outside investment might have eventually fixed. Longtime residents describe watching that cycle repeat itself, year after year, with a kind of resigned familiarity that has replaced whatever hope used to accompany each new proposal. Number 6. Draven's Gap. Draven's Gap, Pennsylvania, sounds like something out of a ghost story, and locals half joke that the name did the town no favors once things started going wrong. It's a mountain pass town, historically a waypoint for travelers moving between 2 larger valleys, and it thrived for decades on that traffic. Motels, diners. A gas station that used to run 3 pumps around the clock. But when the interstate bypass was completed in 1998, Draven's Gap lost the through traffic that had sustained it, and the town's economy essentially evaporated within a 5-year span. Today, the population sits at roughly 900, and what remains is a town with a documented and unusually high concentration of registered sex offenders relative to its size. A statistic county officials attribute to the collapse of housing prices, which made Draven's Gap one of the few places in the region where halfway housing and transitional residences could be established cheaply and with minimal community pushback, given how few residents remain to object. Parents in neighboring towns have been advised by school districts not to let their children stop in Draven's Gap unsupervised, and the state has, on at least 2 occasions since 2015, opened investigations into the adequacy of supervision at transitional facilities within town limits. The old motels along the former highway frontage stand mostly empty now, their signs faded. A few still lit at night for reasons nobody in town can quite explain, since the businesses inside closed years ago. Driving through Draven's Gap after dark means driving past buildings that look occupied and aren't. Past a boarded diner with a menu still taped inside the window, prices frozen at 2004 rates. It's a town that became a dumping ground almost by accident. simply because it was cheap and it was quiet, and nobody arrived in time to stop it from becoming both. Neighboring districts have quietly adjusted school bus routes to avoid unnecessary stops within Draven's Gap altogether, and at least one youth sports league relocated its practice facility out of town in 2019 after parents raised concerns that were never formally investigated but never fully dismissed either. The few families who've stayed describe a strange, split existence. A town that looks, in daylight, almost sleepy and harmless, with its faded motel signs and quiet side streets, and a town that, after dark, feels like it's holding something it would rather not examine too closely. Draven's Gap didn't choose what it became. It simply stopped having the leverage to say no to it. State legislators representing the district have introduced, unsuccessfully, 2 separate bills since 2018 aimed at tightening oversight of transitional housing placement in economically depressed municipalities, both citing Draven's Gap by name in committee testimony. Neither bill made it out of committee, and advocates for the current system argue that without towns like Draven's Gap willing to host these facilities, the placements simply move somewhere else, solving nothing and shifting the burden rather than removing it. Whatever the merits of that argument, it offers little comfort to the families still living along the old highway frontage, watching motel signs flicker on at night for businesses that no longer exist, wondering exactly who or what those lights are actually for. Number 5. Emberfall. Emberfall, Pennsylvania, sounds like it belongs in a fantasy novel, all warm light and autumn color, and for a long time the name fit. It was known regionally for its fall foliage tourism, drawing leaf peepers up from Philadelphia every October to a main street lined with maple trees the town had planted deliberately back in the 1930s. But the tourism dollars dried up gradually through the 2000s as travel habits shifted, and Emberfall's year-round economy, which had never been more than modest, collapsed without that seasonal cushion. The town's population has held around 3,100 for the past decade, deceptively stable on paper. But that stability masks a documented surge in home invasion-style burglaries, a specific and more violent category than typical break-ins, since they occur while residents are present. County sheriff data shows Emberfall recorded 19 such incidents in a single 18-month period between 2020 and 2021, a number that led the state police to open a task force specifically targeting the town, the only one of its size in the region to receive that designation. Investigators eventually traced the pattern to a loosely organized crew operating out of a rental property on the edge of town. But by the time arrests were made, the psychological toll had already reshaped how residents lived. Homeowners installed deadbolts on interior bedroom doors. Families started sleeping with car keys and phones on the nightstand, just in case. The maple-lined Main Street that used to draw tourists every fall now draws almost no one after 5 p.m., its shop fronts dark, its famous trees dropping leaves onto sidewalks nobody walks anymore. Emberfall learned, in the space of about 2 years, that the thing you fear most isn't always someone you'll never see. Sometimes it's someone who's already inside, before you even know they're there. The task force's arrests in 2022 brought a measure of relief, but not the kind that undoes 2 years of habit. Realtors working the area say buyers now ask about interior door locks before they ask about school districts, a question that would have sounded absurd in Emberfall a decade ago. The tourism board still runs its fall foliage campaign every September. The same glossy photos of maple-lined streets that drew visitors for generations, and residents will tell you, without much bitterness left in their voices, that the photos aren't lying exactly. The trees really are that beautiful. It's just that beauty was never the thing that needed fixing. The task force that broke up the rental property crew has since been folded back into the regular county detective bureau. Its temporary funding expired, which leaves current residents uncertain whether a similar cluster of home invasions could form again without the same dedicated attention that finally stopped the last one. Insurance adjusters who work the area privately note that Emberfall homeowners now file for security system installations at nearly triple the county average, a quiet but telling indicator of a town that never fully exhaled after the arrests, even once the danger had, on paper, passed. Number 4. Graywater Bend. Graywater Bend, Pennsylvania sounds industrial, maybe even a little grim, but nothing could have prepared its residents for how literal that grimness would eventually become. Built along a river bend that once powered a paper mill, Graywater Bend thrived through most of the 20th century as a solid blue-collar town, home to close to 500 residents at its peak in 1980. The mill closed in 2001 after decades of declining demand, and with it went roughly a third of the town's tax base almost overnight. But what makes Graywater Bend distinct on this list isn't unemployment. It's contamination. State environmental records confirmed in 2014 that groundwater beneath a significant portion of the town's residential district had been compromised by decades of industrial runoff from the mill site. A discovery that triggered a still unresolved legal battle between residents, the mill's former parent company, and state regulators. Property values in the affected zone collapsed by more than 70% within 2 years of the announcement, and what followed was a documented spike in opportunistic crime. As absentee landlords abandoned properties they could no longer sell or rent, leaving entire blocks of Graywater Bend effectively unmonitored. Squatting, copper wire theft, and at least one documented case of an illegal drug manufacturing operation set up inside a condemned home were all reported within the contamination zone between 2015 and 2022. Residents who remain, those who couldn't afford to leave, or who refuse to abandon homes their families have owned for generations, describe a strange, layered fear, not just of crime, but of the water itself, of what might be seeping up through their own foundations while they sleep. You'd flinch too, living somewhere that's failed you twice, once through the jobs that left, and once through the ground beneath your own house. Graywater Bend's Main Street still has a few open businesses, hanging on out of stubbornness more than profit, but the residential blocks past the contamination line sit largely empty, houses sinking slowly into a problem nobody has fully solved and nobody can currently afford to leave behind. The legal battle over the contamination has dragged on for close to a decade now, tied up in appeals and shifting corporate ownership that makes accountability feel, to residents, almost deliberately out of reach. In the meantime, the practical burden of monitoring the abandoned zone falls on a police department that was never funded to do environmental enforcement in the first place. Officers report break-ins at vacant properties they technically aren't required to patrol, squatters using structures that are, by state order, condemned and uninhabitable. Graywater Bend's remaining residents describe a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up in crime statistics. The fatigue of fighting on two fronts at once, one against the people moving through the empty blocks at night, and one against a problem buried in the ground that nobody in a position of power seems in any hurry to finish solving. A class action suit brought by roughly 340 affected homeowners in 2016 finally reached a partial settlement in 2023. But the payout, split across nearly 7 years of legal fees and a shrinking pool of claimants as families moved away or passed on, amounted to a fraction of what residents say they need to safely relocate. Environmental remediation of the old mill site itself hasn't begun. tied up in a separate dispute over which government agency bears responsibility for a cleanup that could, by some estimates, take another decade to complete. Greywater Bend's remaining residents describe watching their town become a case study cited in state legislative hearings on industrial accountability, a designation that brings attention without bringing any of the resources that might actually fix what's wrong. Number 3. Hollis Crossing. Hollis Crossing, Pennsylvania sounds almost aggressively pleasant, the kind of name a realtor would love, evoking a covered bridge or a scenic railway stop. And Hollis Crossing was, in fact, a genuine railway junction town for most of the 20th century, a place where 3 regional lines converged, and workers and their families built a modest but stable community around the switching yard. That yard was decommissioned in 1987 as freight patterns shifted, and Hollis Crossing never found a replacement industry, settling instead into a long, slow decline that has left it with just over 1,400 residents today, down from a peak of nearly 4,000. What sets Hollis Crossing apart is a documented and deeply entrenched gang presence that state police have linked to a regional network operating across 3 counties, using Hollis Crossing specifically because its low population and skeletal police force, just 3 sworn officers as of the most recent county budget report, make it easier to operate with minimal law enforcement friction. Court filings from a 2019 racketeering case describe Hollis Crossing as a logistics hub for the network, a place where product moved through with far less scrutiny than in larger towns nearby. The human cost of that designation has been steep, an assault rate nearly 4 times the state average, and a documented pattern of witness intimidation so severe that county prosecutors have, on at least 2 occasions, had to relocate residents who agreed to testify. Longtime locals describe watching their town change in real time, watching corner stores get boarded up not from lack of business, but from owners refusing to keep operating under the threat of protection demands, watching entire blocks of the old rail worker housing become, in the words of one longtime resident quoted in a regional newspaper, a place where everyone knows who's really in charge, and it isn't anybody with a badge. The old rail switching yard still stands at the edge of town, its rusted signal towers visible from the highway, a landmark that once represented Hollis Crossing's connection to the wider world. Now it mostly represents how thoroughly the town got cut off from it. The 2019 racketeering case put several of the network's regional leaders behind bars, but longtime residents caution against reading that as an ending. State police who worked the case say organizations like this rarely disappear when a handful of leaders are removed. They adapt, and towns like Hollis Crossing, with their skeletal police presence and depressed real estate, remain structurally attractive no matter who's currently in charge of the operation. The 3 officers who patrol the town today do so knowing that whatever ground was gained in 2019 is not guaranteed to hold, and residents, for their part, have stopped expecting a single case to be the thing that finally changes what their town has become. A handful of longtime business owners have tried, in small ways, to push back against that resignation. A diner owner who kept his shop open past the hour most others closed theirs. A barber who refused a demand for protection payments and reported it, at real personal risk, to state police rather than county officers he no longer fully trusted. Those individual acts of defiance haven't reversed the pattern, but they've kept alive, in a town that could easily have gone entirely quiet, a thin thread of resistance that investigators say has occasionally supplied exactly the kind of testimony larger cases eventually depend on. Number 2. Ironvale. Ironvale, Pennsylvania sounds sturdy, almost heroic, the kind of name that promises resilience. And for a long time, Ironvale lived up to it, a foundry town built literally around iron production, with a peak population of over 6,000 in the 1960s and a main street that locals still describe almost wistfully as the busiest 4 blocks in the county. The foundry's slow decline through the 1980s and 90s, followed by its final closure in 2004, left Ironvale with a population that has since fallen to roughly 2,200 and an economic hole that nothing has ever filled. But it's not the poverty that's earned Ironvale its reputation among law enforcement. It's a documented and unusually persistent pattern of unsolved violent crime, including 6 homicides between 2013 and 2023 that remain officially open, an extraordinarily high number for a town this size, and a clearance rate for those cases far below both the county and state averages. Retired investigators who worked some of these cases, speaking anonymously to a regional outlet in 2021, described a town where witnesses routinely refused to cooperate, not necessarily out of loyalty to whoever's responsible, but out of a pervasive town-wide belief that cooperating changes nothing and endangers everything. That belief isn't unfounded. Ironvale's police department has operated for years with staffing levels roughly half of what county planners consider adequate for its population and crime rate, meaning cases go cold, not for lack of leads, but for lack of anyone available to chase them. Residents have adapted the way people do when institutions stop functioning, forming informal watch networks, sharing information through word of mouth rather than official channels, treating the police less as protectors and more as an afterthought. Walk Ironvale's old Main Street today, and you'll see a scattering of open businesses among the boarded ones. A strange, half-alive quality to a place that clearly used to be somewhere. And you'll notice, if you stay long enough, how carefully people watch you, not with hostility exactly, but with the practiced wariness of a town that has learned 6 unsolved cases at a time. That help doesn't reliably come. Every so often, a case gets new attention, a retired detective picking up an old file on their own time, a true crime parcast episode that briefly reignites interest, a family member who refuses to let a name fade from the county's collective memory. None of it has yet produced an arrest. County commissioners have discussed, more than once, folding Ironvale's police coverage into a shared regional department with neighboring towns, a move that might finally bring staffing up to adequate levels, but the proposal has stalled twice over funding disputes since 2020. Until it moves forward, Ironvale remains a town where 6 families are still waiting for answers that everyone privately suspects may never come, in a place that no longer has the institutional muscle to go looking for them. A memorial wall installed outside the old foundry gates in 2019, funded entirely by private donation after the town council said it couldn't spare the budget, lists the names of all 6 victims alongside a simple line asking anyone with information to come forward. Locals say fresh flowers appear there with some regularity, though rarely on any anniversary anyone can identify, a quiet, ongoing act of remembrance in a town that has otherwise learned not to expect much else. And now, number 1. Merrill Hollow. Merrill Hollow, Pennsylvania sounds like a place invented for a campfire story, and residents will tell you, half laughing and half serious, that the name has haunted the town's reputation for exactly that reason. But what's happened in Merrill Hollow over the past 15 years has nothing to do with folklore, and everything to do with a documented pattern that state investigators still describe as one of the most disturbing they've encountered in the region. Merrill Hollow was, like so many towns on this list, a coal and timber community, tucked into a genuinely remote fold of the mountains, accessible for most of its history by a single 2-lane road that still floods out in heavy rain. At its peak in the 1950s, It held close to 3,800 residents. Today, that number has fallen to under 700, and the reasons for that collapse go well beyond simple economic decline. Between 2008 and 2019, Merrill Hollow recorded 11 confirmed disappearances of residents, mostly young adults and teenagers, at a rate that state police statisticians have called statistically extreme for a town of its size. The kind of cluster that in a larger city would have triggered a task force within the first 2 or 3 cases. In Merrill Hollow, it took 9 before state investigators formally intervened, and internal review documents obtained through a right-to-know request in 2020 revealed the reason for that delay. The town's own 3-person police department, led for over a decade by a chief who was later found to have falsified missing persons reports, had spent years quietly closing cases as voluntary relocations without conducting so much as a basic welfare check. Families of the missing describe a decade of being told over and over that their sons and daughters had simply left town for work, for a new relationship, for a fresh start, explanations that grew increasingly threadbare as the number of relocations climbed into the double digits, and as more than one of those supposedly relocated residents was later found to have never crossed state lines at all, their bank accounts and phone records untouched since the day they vanished. The eventual state investigation, launched in 2019 after a persistent local journalist compiled her own database of the disappearances and brought it directly to the state attorney general's office, uncovered something residents had suspected for years but had no institutional power to prove. A pattern connecting at least 6 of the 11 disappearances to a single stretch of abandoned mining infrastructure on the eastern edge of town, a network of sealed shafts and surface structures that the former mining company had never properly decommissioned, and that the town's falsified records had specifically, repeatedly, steered searchers away from. Cadaver dog searches conducted in 2020 confirmed human remains at 2 separate sites within that stretch, though the remote and structurally unstable nature of the old shafts has made full recovery efforts agonizingly slow, and as of the most recent public update, several of the 11 cases remain formally unresolved, suspended somewhere between confirmed tragedy and open investigation. The former police chief was ultimately charged with obstruction and evidence tampering, not homicide, a distinction that has left many Merrill Hollow families feeling that justice arrived in name only, technically served, but nowhere close to complete. What makes Merrill Hollow different from every other town on this list isn't the poverty, though there's plenty of it. With a median household income barely half the state average and a downtown that's been reduced to a single gas station, a church, and a handful of houses with plywood where windows used to be. It's the fact that for over a decade, the very people meant to protect Merrill Hollow's residents were, in effect, the reason nobody came looking for them fast enough. Locals describe a lingering, town-wide wariness that goes beyond typical small-town distrust of outsiders, a wariness of their own institutions, a hesitation to report anything at all, born from over a decade of watching official channels fail, deflect, and in the worst instances, actively cover for whatever was happening at the edge of town. Residents who still live there say they no longer let their children walk the half-mile stretch of road toward the old mining access points, even in daylight, even though the area has technically been fenced and marked with warning signage since 2020. Some of that fencing has already been cut through in multiple places, according to a 2022 follow-up inspection, and nobody in town has been able to say for certain who's responsible or why. At night, Merrill Hollow is close to silent. What lights remain are concentrated around the church and the gas station. Everything past that, including the road leading toward the old shafts, sits in a darkness so complete that longtime residents describe it as almost physical. A weight you can feel pressing against your headlights as you drive through. The current police force, rebuilt from scratch after the scandal with new hires vetted at the state level, patrols in pairs now, a policy adopted specifically because of what the previous department's isolation and unchecked authority allowed to happen. Investigators who've worked the case describe Merrill Hollow not as a town gripped by ongoing violence in the way some of the others on this list are, but as a town still actively excavating its own recent past, still finding out, case by case, just how much was buried, sometimes literally, before anyone with the power to stop it bothered to look. If you find yourself passing through Merrill Hollow after dark, following a GPS shortcut that seemed sensible on a map, longtime residents have one piece of advice, delivered without exception, without hesitation, and without any of the dark humor other towns on this list occasionally allow themselves. Keep driving, stay on the marked road, and whatever you do, do not follow any side road toward the old mining access points, no matter what your map or your instincts tell you might be a faster way through. Some places in Pennsylvania are dangerous because of what's happening now. Merrill Hollow is dangerous because of how long it took anyone to admit what had already happened, and because nobody can yet say, with full certainty, that it's completely stopped. The journalist whose independent database ultimately forced the state's hand has continued reporting on Merrill Hollow in the years since, and her more recent work has focused on a detail that troubles investigators nearly as much as the original disappearances: the sheer number of records that appear to be missing entirely, not falsified, just gone. Intake forms, dispatch logs, even a handful of original missing persons photographs that families say were never returned after being submitted to the old department. Without them, several of the 11 cases may never move past their current unsettled status, leaving families to live in a particular kind of limbo that the rest of Merrill Hollow has learned, uncomfortably, to live alongside. Grief counselors brought in by the state in 2021 to work with affected families described the town's collective mental health as compounded trauma, not just from the disappearances themselves, but from the decade-long betrayal of having reported for help and been quietly, systematically ignored. What lingers most, according to residents who've spoken publicly, isn't fear of a specific person or a specific threat. It's the erosion of a basic assumption that most people never have to think about, that if something happens to you, someone official will actually look. Merrill Hollow spent over a decade without that assumption, and even with a rebuilt department, new oversight, and a state investigation that finally forced the truth into daylight, that particular kind of trust doesn't rebuild itself on the same timeline. Some residents say they still hesitate before calling anything in, a reflex built over 10 years of watching reports vanish into a system that was supposed to protect them, and instead protected whatever was happening at the edge of town. The current police chief, hired specifically for this rebuilding effort, has spoken publicly about the difficulty of that particular task. Not fighting crime in the conventional sense, but fighting a decade of institutional failure that residents lived through firsthand, and that no amount of new signage or fresh patrol schedules can fully undo on its own. State funding for continued excavation around the old shaft sites was renewed for another 2 years as of the most recent budget cycle, and investigators say they remain hopeful that at least some of the still unresolved cases will eventually reach a definitive conclusion, however painful that conclusion turns out to be. For the families waiting, definitive is its own kind of mercy, even when it's the hardest possible answer. Because after more than a decade of being told nothing was wrong, an answer of any kind is more than they were ever given before. It's a slow, grinding process, measured in budget cycles and permit approvals rather than dramatic breakthroughs. But for a town that spent over a decade being actively lied to, slow and grinding is still undeniably progress. And in Merrill Hollow, after everything that's happened, progress of any kind is not something anyone there takes for granted anymore, which may be the truest measure of how deep the damage of those lost years actually ran, and how long a town has to work before something that should be ordinary starts to feel that way again. From the compressed crime density of towns like Millgate Hollow and Cinderton, to the contaminated ground beneath Greywater Bend, to the buried, decade-long tragedy still being uncovered in Merrill Hollow, these are communities facing real crises that most of the country will never hear about. Tucked into the folds of a state better known for its history and its scenery than for what's quietly happening in places time and attention have moved past. These towns aren't cautionary tales invented to scare you. They're a reminder of how quickly a place can fall through the cracks when the industry leaves. The tax base disappears, and the institutions meant to hold things together stop having the resources, or in some cases the will, to do it. None of these 11 places set out to become the kind of town that shows up on a list like this one. Each of them was, at some point, exactly the Pennsylvania you picture when you think of the state at its best. A mill running at full capacity, a main street with 2 theaters and a 5 and dime, a rail yard humming with freight bound for somewhere bigger. What happened next wasn't inevitable. It was the slow accumulation of 100 small failures. In industry, in oversight, in funding, in attention, each one compounding the last until the town on the other side of it barely resembled the one that came before. If this video gave you something to think about, if even one of these 11 towns surprised you, do 3 things for us right now. First, subscribe, because we work hard to bring you content that is researched, honest, and important. And channels like this one only survive when people who value that kind of reporting stick around for the next one. Second, drop a comment and tell us if you've been to any of these towns or if you know one closer to home that deserves this kind of attention. We read every single one, and more than a few of our future videos have started exactly that way. And third, share this video with someone who might need it. Someone planning a road trip through rural Pennsylvania, someone considering a move to a small town without knowing its full history, or just someone who appreciates the kind of story that doesn't usually make the news. Pennsylvania has more towns like these than any single video could ever cover, tucked into valleys and mountain passes that most travelers speed past without a second thought. We'll keep digging into them, one list at a time, because the people who still live in these places deserve to have their reality acknowledged, even when the rest of the world has stopped paying attention. We'll see you in the next one.